So as we introduced the Philosophes in class, you have those notes and understanding their significance towards the Enlightenment. We're going to go into detail and covering several different ones. It's really just an overview for you to understand each of their contributions and their impact to European history. Okay, so the first one I'm going to be talking about is the Prince of Philosophes. This is Voltaire. That's his pen name. He's from the middle class. There's a little bit of background about him. Very sarcastic, witty, and he had a huge commitment to intellectual freedom. That was kind of his core value that he would write from, and based upon a lot of the things that he put out in writing, his influence allowed him to be very much admired, but at the same time resented, depending upon where you stand in society. And so he's going to be the most influential philosophe during the Enlightenment. Okay, so I have one quote that Voltaire once said, and it says, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." Okay, I'll say it one more time. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And so his aim at with this quote specifically is he's targeting the religious fanatics, those that are going out of line, the extremists, those that are hypocritical in saying one thing but doing another. A lot of church leaders he found to be in this way. And another famous quote that he would also say is to crush the infamous thing, and the thing being organized religion. So he was, whether you're Protestant or Catholic, he was against organized religion. He himself was a deist, so he wasn't an atheist. He was a deist. And he says, instead of putting your trust in your religious faith to bring types of progress and solutions to the problems, but reason is going to be the factor that can bring change. Okay, so one of his works is called the Philosophical Letters on the English. Let's see, if I can. Okay, and he really admired the balanced government that the English had, or the constitutional monarchy, the fact that their country had religious tolerance. He really supported that as well. And so he spent 2 years in Frederick the Great's court. Being part of his court, right, allowed Frederick the Great to understand what it means to have reforms that were inspired by the Enlightenment. And through that, we're going to see Frederick the Great as one of our examples of an enlightened despot, as I mentioned before. And so essentially Voltaire believes that you cannot trust the masses because they're ignorant, they're uneducated, and so there should be this type of top-down type of rule, much like what Hobbes would agree to. And so Voltaire would also be an influence upon Catherine the Great and Joseph II, and also Napoleon as leaders. Another work that he put out was Candide, and this is a novelette, and the story goes that this young man goes on his life journey, and eventually his lesson that he learns, his life lesson, is that the best thing to hope in is for each individual to develop their intellectual capacity without being interfered by exterior things. Okay, so developing your own intellectual capacity very much ties in line with his core value of having intellectual freedom, just the ability in order to have this type of freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of your beliefs. Another quote, he says, "I do not believe in a word you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it." And so even though he may disagree, he still believes that every person should be able to voice what they believe. Okay, so as far as the value of equality, he believed that people are equal before the law. However, they are not equal in terms of social classes. So you can still have different social classes. Some are more superior than others, but as far as the law goes, that is just should be applied to everyone. Okay. All right, let's jump over to Montesquieu. You guys should be familiar with him in your world history class and U.S. history and stuff. A little bit of background. He is a noble. He's from France. He is an aristocrat, so that means he's a landowner, and his background allows him to put out his works that he's known for. And one thing that we understand is that during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, right, he was an absolutist monarch, and because of his absolute rule, Montesquieu did not like how the French kings would go about their reign. Okay, one of his first works is the Persian Letters in 1721. This is a very satirical work, and basically it's a story about two visitors from Persia, and he chose Persia because they were known in the intellectual world to be the most despotic kingdom. So basically the ones with the tyrants of absolute rule. And so when these two Persian visitors are coming to France, they notice the customs, they notice how the government's being run, and even the Persians see it as very strange and ridiculous of how the French act. And in that sense, it's really just trying to put a spin and showing that France is really far from how it should be. Okay, his next work is The Spirit of Laws. This one we should be very familiar with. Basically, it has the ideas of separation of powers in government. So you have three branches, okay, executive, judicial, legislative. This is what the American government has taken from. But essentially, during the time of Montesquieu, he says that there should be the monarchy, the nobility, and then the rest of the people, and they between them should have this checks and balances. He is going to favor the British system because they had a constitutional monarchy, as I mentioned. France has the parlements, which are these judicial tribunals. So these nobles are meeting together, and essentially they are able to check against the absolute rule of the monarch from becoming a tyrant. The goal that Montesquieu had was that he does not want to have tyranny, as he imagined Louis XIV was. He wanted to have liberty and also to have a restored balance between the monarch and nobility. So he felt that the nobles' powers, which they were, right, were being abused, or the monarch's powers were being abused upon the nobility. One thing to know is that even though this is going to impact and inspire the American Revolution and the American Constitution, Montesquieu never imagined to have a democratic or a republican form of government. And the reason why is because he felt that, and much of many other Enlightenment thinkers thought this way too, was that democracy often would equal into anarchy because people, never really had a successful democratic type of system, at least in terms of modern Europe. Okay, so the principle of checks and balances is what we need to take away. Separation of powers, checks and balances, and so as we understand, right, each branch is checking each other. So at least you don't have one power having a way to abuse their authority upon the rest of the country. Okay, and so the French Revolution and the U.S. Constitution are both going to be influenced by Montesquieu and be quoted by him. Okay, let's jump into Rousseau. Okay, Rousseau, really interesting guy as you kind of like dig deeper into philosophy and stuff. A lot of his works will be pretty interesting when you understand his background. So he's actually from a lower middle class background, so definitely of kind of more that working class, and like still economically struggling. When he's growing up as a child, he was neglected, and so a lot of family problems. Later, he's going to be marrying some barmaid lady, and we'll talk about that in a second. But knowing that that's part of his background, right? Not the most affluent compared to some of other guys. He is known to be part of the later part of the Enlightenment, and he's part of more of what we call the radical phase, which is towards the end part of the Enlightenment. A little bit less grounded on reason, a little bit less grounded on the empirical approach of observation and natural laws. He was what we call more of a romantic. We're going to go into the romantic movement throughout Europe, and so he believed that many thinkers put too much of an emphasis on property and not enough consideration on people. So property over people was his issue, and so he felt that this was kind of one of the root causes of social injustice. The fact that people were kind of like putting as a secondary priority instead of the primary issue. So he's very much a people person, right? So after the French Revolution, Enlightenment's going to shift away from reason and go towards more of an emotional, glorified way to see change. Rousseau saw that if man was part of more of a simpler state of nature, that was fine in itself. It was good because he used the phrase "a noble savage," which he was intending of speaking about Native Americans, that they were having their own society, they had their own civilization, but they weren't corrupted by materialism and development, and they found happiness in the way that they lived. And he believes that man could, in a sense, achieve the same, having the simpler state of nature. Okay. He first wrote Social Contract in 1762, really important work. This is what he's kind of on the map for. As I said, his focus on people. And one of his quotes that he says is, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." And he's definitely trying to demonstrate that man should have certain freedoms and a certain consensus amongst them all, which he calls the general will. Okay, so the general will is a really essential term that you should associate with Rousseau. The general will is basically the majority vote, and that the majority is the one that is controlling the nation, that the social contract is amongst the people and themselves, not with the government, not with authority. So this is, very much following a very much democratic model. One thing to understand is that the social contract is not a physical document. It's not a political contract that is signed. It is more of an agreement that is shared as a value. This is, going to build upon this concept of popular sovereignty, which we're going to see later on in French Revolution and moving on from that. Okay, so the best example of what I think Rousseau is really trying to describe is a direct democracy, that every single person, their vote matters, and ideally, you would want this because he believes that, every man should be born free, but he's being restricted and limited wherever he is. But it's really hard to run this in an entire country. If you would imagine each country has millions of people, how are you going to really have a successful direct democracy? So this should essentially only work in maybe a small city-state. So the downside of having just majority rules as a very democratic government is that a lot of minority will be overlooked. Their needs, their viewpoints, their perspectives are not going to be recognized because the majority will always win. Majority becomes a tyrant towards the minority. So though his ideas do support democracy, many people to come after him, they're more like dictators, such as Maximilien Robespierre. He's going to take this idea of the general will and he's going to kind of like twist it, manipulate it, and it's going to bring a lot of extreme radical nationalism, and he's going to abuse that power, saying, "Oh, well, the general will. This is best for what the majority wants." Okay. His other work is called Emile, and this was in 1762. He wrote this based upon education. He believes that education should be progressive. It should change. It shouldn't be based upon rote memorization of word definition, just memorizing, but it should be experiential. You should learn by doing. You should be able to express yourself at all times. So very much, romanticized way of education. One thing to understand is that he had 5 children with the barmaid, as I mentioned, right? Except that they were abandoned, and he left them at an orphanage, and he did not educate them. So thinkers sometimes, at least romantic sometimes even, can't follow their own advice. Okay, all right. So we went over some of the political theories and stuff. Now let's go into more of the legal reforms. So Cesare Beccaria, as you may be familiar with him as well, he wanted to bring a lot of legal reform laws in changing how crime should be dealt with. So governments during the 18th century, right, 1700s, they lacked modern police forces and prisons. They did not have those. Punishments were very much in the public eye and were very harsh. And the reason why is because they want to set example, right? So torture would be used to kind of like when you torture them, as I see in some of these examples as you see over here, or you try to get them to confess of the crimes they did or didn't do even. There's also tortures of breaking on the wheel, where they're on a wheel and they're being tied to the rope, and eventually, limb by limb, their entire body is going to be just broken and stretched out. And then there's also the quartering, like a rope is tied to each of the limbs to different horses, and the horses are kicked, and then they are sent off into 4 different directions, and eventually you can imagine limb by limb, it's broken apart from the torso. And so that's how punishment was, very gruesome, very bloody and stuff. And so his goal, as he wrote through on crime and punishments, he wanted to humanize criminal law. The punishments were way too severe, and he believed that reason would allow proper punishments to be decided, and that there should be equality before law. There shouldn't be anyone to decide what the punishment should be, because they didn't really have a real strong court system or even a police force. So punishment should be fit for the crime, right? So depending upon what the crime is, that would rationally, by reason, depending upon who is affected in society, that should say what is proper, right? So if you steal, then you should pay back, right? If you commit some other crime, right, it should be rational based upon how damaging is it to the people around you. And one thing he emphasized, that it should not be linked to the religious concept of sin. Okay, so by reforming the criminal law system, this is going to allow prisons to be built, because the idea of disciplining criminals institutionally, right? So being sent to prison, and that's where they learn from their mistakes. That's kind of one of the parts of reforming the criminal law system, as well as how the punishments should be changed. As far as the death penalty, he is against it, except for situations where if the state is being threatened in a very severe way, then possibly he would support the death penalty. And so his overall influence is going to be upon Prussia and Russia with the Enlightened despots, where torture is going to be banned, right, and also death penalty in some areas as well, depending upon which ruler it is. Okay, but overall, he has brought a lot of rationality to the punishments. Okay, all right. More philosophical now. David Hume is one of the leaders of the Scottish Enlightenment, and one thing that he's known for in general is just the label of being a skeptic. And so really quickly, so he argued and rejected reason. He didn't feel like it was one of the points of emphasis. He rejected religion. He rejected miracles. He argued that faith and natural law cannot be trusted, right? And so what he really believes is that human knowledge should be based completely and radically upon empiricism. And so based upon your immediate observations at that very moment, that's the only thing that you can accept, right? So as a skeptic, he believed that all human ideas and knowledge were merely the results of the sensory experiences that you're having at that time. So even human reason, by imagining and thinking logically through, that could not go beyond what was before his very eyes, okay, before your senses, before your smell and sight and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so by undermining Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, we can see that there aren't always a cookie cutter for all philosophes. Some kind of differ on certain points than others. And David Hume, as you can see in this way, still wants to bring progress, but through a different way, completely more of an empirical approach rather than more of a rational way. Okay, all right. Kant is going to counter Hume. Kant is known to be the greatest German philosopher of the Enlightenment from Prussia. Brilliant guy. We read one of his sources in class, right? He did says that you should dare to know, to use your own intelligence, right? Have the courage to use your own intelligence to understand, to be rid of immaturity, right? And it's only because of ourselves that hold us back from really comprehending what is out there. And he dedicated his life to developing a complete system of philosophy. So to really understand his philosophy, it's very complex, and I'm not going to go into it. But essentially, he tries to combine two things, and that is rationalism and empiricism. And so, as Hume says, no rationalism, just empiricism. Um, Kant says that by understanding these abstract concepts, such as time, space, and causation, based upon logic, based upon reason, this provides us knowledge about what we experience, which is empiricism. Okay, so by combining rationalism and empiricism, that gives us a better understanding of how our experiences connect to time, space, causation, how the world works. Okay, he saw that science and morality were two good things, but actually two separate branches of knowledge, and that science's job is to describe nature, but as far as morality, that was kind of its own realm in itself, its own knowledge base and philosophy in itself. One thing that he came up with was this thing called categorical imperative, and so he believes that each person has an instinct within them that's very intuitive, that God has given, and that is what our human conscience is, right? And so the categorical imperative shows us that in ethics of what is right and wrong, right, and also in appreciating beauty and aesthetics, humans could only tap into this through this categorical imperative, right? Not through science, not through reason and rational thought, right? So reason is just how your mind can function, but it doesn't have any content in itself. So as far as ethics and kind of the moral being that each person has, right, and seeing beyond just the natural world, that's something that the categorical imperative kind of taps into. One last thing I want to talk about Kant is that he established this philosophy called constructivism, which he believes that our perceptions, our experiences that we have, is what constructs the world. Okay, based upon what we see, what we do. Okay, how we perceive things is then how I understand everything. Okay, it sounds very general, but instead of going into it where I really need to explain it, which does not really matter that much, just understand that he believes that your experiences is what helps you build your perceptions and how the world works in that way, constructing. Okay, so he's going to go against Hume. He believes that ethics can be objectively determined, right, by testing it whether or not it could be applied universally without contradiction. So his approach to ethics contrasts Hume, because Hume believes that it's only based upon your experiences that you can make decisions, where Kant believes that you could have a rational, logical statement as long as it does not have contradictions in it. Okay. All right. Last slide. Here we go. So we went over political theory, we went over some legal reforms. Now we're going to go over economic theory, and so we have two main guys. The physiocrats, or these French philosophers / economists, and they're going to criticize mercantilism because while mercantilism believed that you should control the economy by exporting as much as possible and importing importing less, and that you should have a large amount of bullion, right? A lot of cash, a lot of tangible tradable goods, the physiocrats believe that the true source of wealth is land. Okay, and by having land, this is going to provide your country with agricultural sustenance as one, but also minerals to be used. So land is very precious, right? And we're going to see that many countries do adapt this and understand this, and they always have, and that governments should, if anything, be open and promote the development of commercial agriculture by not keeping their feudal restrictions on land by allowing people just to do whatever they want on land, but promoting this commercial agriculture because it's going to really grow your country. The idea of laissez-faire economics is going to be coming through the physiocrats. Laissez-faire meaning let it be, let the people do what they want. Okay, and one of the first leaders of the French physiocrats is going to be Francois Quetenet, and he opposed the policies of the mercantilists because, like I said, with the physiocrats, he wanted to have some changes, some reforms in the agrarian system. He believed that the French government and the nobility had too much control over the land, which then stifled the production of agriculture. Building off of Francois Quetenet, Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations. The Wealth of Nations was considered to be kind of like the Bible, the main source of capitalist ideas, and he is going to refine and expand upon the laissez-faire philosophy. He believes not just land is important, but he believes that labor is a source of value. So by combining labor and raw materials, that is what allows you to build a product, okay, or make a product. So a few points about how capitalism works and what came from Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations was that he believed that the economy in general is governed by natural laws of supply and demand, right? And so there's this invisible hand that controls what is the right price, what is the right amount to be sold and made in quantity, and governments don't need to fix prices or anything. Government should be staying out of it. They should not be intervening at all. He also believes that there should be a free market economy, that competition will come naturally by itself and through competition, not forcing companies to sell it this way or make things this way by the government. Competition will encourage the producers to create more efficient goods that are higher quality, lower in cost. And you think about it, America has this in an example. There's so many different kinds of coffee shops. There's so many different kinds of department stores, brands, all that kind of stuff, because there's competition. Government regulation should not interfere with what nations can really achieve by having free trade. Okay, so by having free trade, nations can benefit without tariffs. You don't have to say like, oh, you should only buy English tea or you should only buy English cotton. But by trading freely, you're going to have the benefits of good qualities and good prices and all. Okay, so that's kind of the overview of all these philosophes and all their contributions. You're going to need to know in an FRQ and name drop some of these guys and their ideas, compare and contrast, of course, but also understand the impact, so the significance and their influence coming out of the Enlightenment. That's going to be covering in the next lecture.